Have you ever, like, stopped to think about how you can just walk through a crowded room and not bump into everybody
Yeah.
or, catch a ball without, like, really thinking about where your hand is?
Mhm.
It's pretty wild when you actually consider it, right?
Yeah, it is.
This whole awareness we have of our body moving through space.
Right. We take it for granted.
Totally. So, like, how does our body even sense all that motion?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're going to dive into today.
It's a good question. A really good question.
All those fascinating ways that our bodies perceive movement.
And you're right, it is pretty wild. It really is remarkable how all of that works. And it's not just like one single sense that's doing all the heavy lifting.
Right.
It's like a whole team of sensory systems that are working together,
Yeah.
behind the scenes, constantly feeding information to our brains.
Right. So we're going to explore all those different players in our body. We're going to be pulling from the latest research in behavioral neuroscience
Absolutely.
to give you a real solid understanding of all the mechanisms that are going on.
Yeah. Think of it like peeling back the layers of how this incredible feat of biological engineering actually happens.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a clear, engaging picture of how your body senses movement
Yeah.
without getting too bogged down in super technical jargon and stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, so to start, why don't we start with something that you could think of as your internal guidance system?
Okay.
The vestibular sense.
The vestibular sense. It is your primary system for being able to detect balance and orientation in space.
Right.
So imagine that you've got a built-in motion sensor, right? Like a really sophisticated miniature motion sensor.
Wow.
That's built right into your head.
Yeah.
That's basically what's going on in your inner ear.
Right, exactly. And so when we say inner ear, we're talking about some pretty specific structure.
We are.
We've got the utricle and saccule, and those semicircular canals. I mean, they almost sound like they're straight out of a Jules Verne novel.
They do have a certain fantastical ring to them.
Right.
But the function is incredibly practical, right?
Yeah.
They're what keep you upright.
Yeah.
And aware of how you're moving.
Yeah.
So the utricle and saccule are primarily responsible for detecting linear acceleration.
Okay.
So think about the sensation that you get when you're in a car that speeds up or when you're in an elevator going up or down.
Okay. And
inside of these structures are tiny, tiny little calcium carbonate crystals.
Okay.
They're called otoliths.
Otoliths.
And their movement, in response to gravity or linear motion, is actually what triggers the sensory receptors.
Okay.
So it's like having these little miniature-weighted sensors that can shift with movement.
So these tiny little crystals are acting like small little detectors for the changes in speed and direction or even the pull of gravity.
Precisely. That's exactly what they're doing. They provide that information about those straight line movements.
Okay.
And your head's tilt relative to gravity. And then you have the semicircular canals.
Okay.
These are 3 fluid-filled loops.
Okay.
And they're oriented in different planes.
Okay.
So they're the ones that are responsible for detecting rotational movements.
Okay.
So when you turn your head to look around or when you spin.
Got it.
And the fluid inside of these canals, it lags just a little bit behind the movement of your head.
Okay.
And it's that movement of that fluid that actually stimulates the sensory receptors within the canals.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've got all these intricate organs that are sensing all these different types of movement, but how does our brain know what to do with all of that? How does that raw sensory input get turned into something that our brain can actually understand and make sense of?
Right. Well, that's where the hair cells come into play.
Yeah.
So within the utricle and saccule and the semicircular canals, you have all these microscopic hair cells.
Okay.
And when the otoliths shift, or the fluid in the semicircular canals flows, these hair cells bend.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
The direction that those hair cells bend actually determines whether they send an excitatory or an inhibitory signal to the brain. And this nuanced signaling is actually what allows your brain to get this really detailed picture of the movement.
Right. And those signals don't just stay put in the inner ear.
Yeah,
Right?
no, they don't. They don't.
You got to make it all the way to the brain to be processed.
Absolutely. They are transmitted via the vestibular nerve
Okay.
to a really crucial processing hub in the brainstem.
Okay.
That's called the vestibular nuclei.
Vestibular nuclei.
And you can think of the vestibular nuclei kind of like a central command center.
Gotcha.
That not only receives that information from the inner ear, but it also integrates it with other information
Right.
from other senses. And then from there, that information is relayed to all sorts of different brain areas,
Right.
including the ones that are responsible for, our conscious awareness of movement
Yeah.
and balance. But perhaps one of the most direct and vital connections
Yeah.
is to the muscles that control our eye movements.
Ah, yes. So that's what I was thinking about. I remember, I think we might have even touched upon this a little bit ago, but
Yeah.
how does the inner ear help us keep our eyes focused when our head is moving all around?
It's a really, really elegant example of how efficiently our bodies work.
Right.
So the vestibular sense
Yeah.
plays this critical role in stabilizing our gaze
Okay.
on a target, even when our head is in motion.
Right.
So imagine that you're trying to read a street sign while you're walking.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, your vestibular system
Yeah.
detects the movement of your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And instantly sends these signals to your eye muscles to make these really precise, like compensatory movements
Okay.
in the opposite direction.
Right.
And this keeps the image of that sign
Yeah.
relatively stable on your retina,
Okay.
which allows you to read it clearly. This reflex is known as the vestibulo-ocular reflex.
The vestibulo-ocular reflex.
Got it.
Wow. Isn't that fascinating that like your inner ear is like actively controlling your eye muscles
Totally.
without you even like consciously thinking about
Without
it?
you even knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
That's an incredibly like efficient and vital piece of our sensory apparatus
right.
that we
yeah.
completely take for granted.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, so if that system isn't functioning correctly,
Mm-hmm.
like let's say if someone has a vestibular disorder,
Mm-hmm.
would that maybe explain why they might have trouble focusing their eyes while they're moving?
Precisely. So a failure to maintain that steady gaze
Right.
during head movement
Yeah.
is often a really key clinical indicator that there's some vestibular dysfunction. So it kind of tells medical professionals that there's likely an issue somewhere within, the inner ear or the neural pathways that are involved in this reflex.
Right. Okay. So let's shift gears for a second.
Okay.
Let's talk about another really important sense for movement awareness.
Okay.
Proprioception.
Proprioception.
It's one of those words that can sound a little intimidating,
Yeah.
but when you break it down, it's really just our sense of where our body is in space.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Knowing like the position of our limbs and our body parts relative to each other without even having to look.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Proprioception is really just that.
Right.
The sense of body position
Yes.
and the relative positioning of, our different body segments.
Right.
It's what allows you to like touch your nose
Right.
accurately with your eyes closed.
Yeah.
Or to know that your leg is bent at the knee,
Oh,
even if you can't see it.
Exactly, yeah. So where are these like proprioceptors located that are giving us all this constant feedback about like how our body is configured?
So proprioceptors are specialized sensory receptors,
Okay.
and they're situated within our muscles,
Okay.
our tendons,
Okay.
and our joints.
Did you?
And they're constantly monitoring
Okay.
the state of these tissues
Right.
and sending a continuous stream of information back to the brain
Right.
about, muscle length, muscle tension,
Yeah.
and the angles of our joints.
Okay, so like if I flex my fingers right now,
Uh-huh.
the proprioceptors in like the muscles in my hand and forearm, as well as in the joints in my fingers and wrist, are all sending signals to my brain.
That's exactly right. They're detecting those subtle changes
Right.
in muscle stretch and joint position as you move.
Right.
And that ongoing flow of information is absolutely critical
Yeah.
for the smooth coordination of our movements.
Right.
So think back to reaching for that coffee cup, right? Proprioception allows your brain to know the precise location of your hand and arm.
Okay.
at every instant during that reach,
Okay.
which enables it to make the necessary adjustments to guide your hand accurately to that cup.
Gotcha.
So it's like an internal automatic feedback loop
Right.
for every movement that we make.
So it's almost like we have this like internal body map
Right.
that's constantly being updated.
But that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really fascinating. So, okay, we have the inner ear telling us about our movement and orientation in like the world outside of us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the proprioceptors giving us all this detailed information about our bodies, like internal configuration.
Right.
But where does all this data, where does it converge in the brain to be interpreted?
So a significant portion of this sensory information, including those detailed signals from our proprioceptors and also information about touch,
Okay.
travels to the somatosensory cortex.
The somatosensory cortex.
This is a region that's located in the parietal lobe of your brain,
Okay.
and it's situated just behind the primary motor cortex, which is responsible for actually initiating movements.
Okay. The parietal lobe, it seems like it's like involved in so many different functions in our brain.
It's a very, very busy
Yeah.
and highly interconnected area
Right.
of the brain. But you can think of the somatosensory cortex kind of like the brain's dedicated map
Okay.
of your body.
Gotcha.
So different areas within that cortex are specifically dedicated to processing sensory information from different body parts.
Okay.
And this mapping, it's not just about the sense of touch.
Right.
It also receives and processes that continuous stream of information
Yeah.
from your proprioceptors,
Right.
which is giving you this really, really detailed and
Yeah.
moment-by-moment sense of where your body is in space.
Gotcha.
And it contributes significantly to what we might call our body image.
Oh, that's interesting. So actually, this reminds me, I remember hearing about dermatomes, I think in a previous conversation. How do those relate to like this processing in the somatosensory cortex?
So dermatomes are specific areas of skin
Okay.
that are primarily innervated by a single spinal nerve root.
Okay.
So sensory information from a particular dermatome
Right.
travels along that specific spinal nerve
Okay.
to the spinal cord
Hmm.
and then ascends
Right.
to the somatosensory cortex.
Okay.
So this organized mapping of the body's surface,
Yeah.
right, onto the spinal cord and then the brain.
Right.
It helps the brain understand precisely where on the body a particular sensation is originating.
Wow. Okay, so the somatosensory cortex is constantly getting all this information
Right.
about, touch, pressure, temperature, the position of our body parts.
Constantly.
It's essentially building this ongoing awareness
Yeah.
of our physical self
Right.
and all of its movements.
Exactly. But the perception of movement, it's not as simple as, just these individual senses operating independently.
Oh, okay.
And this is where things get really fascinating.
Yeah, okay.
This integration of all this information
Right.
within the brain.
Right. I was just thinking about that. It feels so seamless
Yeah.
and unified, when we move.
Mm.
Our brain must be doing some serious processing to put it all together.
It absolutely is. Your brain is constantly taking in
Yeah.
and integrating information
Yeah.
from the vestibular sense,
Right.
proprioception, and even our visual system
Right.
to construct this cohesive and accurate understanding of our movement
Okay.
and our orientation in the spatial environment.
Yeah.
These different sensory inputs, it's not just like independent streams of data. They're
Right.
constantly interacting and influencing each other.
Right. So what are some of the key brain regions that are involved in this integration process?
So the posterior parietal cortex is a really, really key player here.
Okay.
It's heavily involved in processing spatial information,
Okay.
and it has these really strong connections to brain areas that are crucial for body awareness,
Right.
including the somatosensory cortex and the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem.
Gotcha.
You could almost think of it like as the brain's spatial reasoning center,
Okay.
where all of these different sensory inputs
Right.
related to movement and position are all combined
Okay.
to give us this unified sense of our body in its surroundings.
And what about the cerebellum and basal ganglia? I know that they're really important for coordinating movement,
Mhm.
but do they directly contribute to actually sensing movement?
That's an important distinction to make.
Yeah.
The cerebellum and basal ganglia are critical
Yeah.
for the planning,
Okay.
the initiation,
Sure.
and fine-tuning of our motor activity. So they contribute significantly to the smoothness
Okay.
and coordination of our movements.
Right.
And they're also involved in motor learning,
Okay.
but they don't directly sense movement in the same primary way
Gotcha.
that the vestibular system or proprioceptors do.
Okay.
Instead, they receive information
Okay.
from these sensory systems.
Right.
And then they use that information to kind of modulate
Oh,
and
sure.
adjust our motor commands.
Okay. So it's a real team effort here.
Totally.
The inner ears providing information about balance and orientation.
Right.
We have proprioceptors keeping the brain updated on body position,
Mm-hmm.
and then the somatosensory cortex processing all of that bodily sensory input.
Right.
And then we have, regions like the posterior parietal cortex that are pulling it all together.
Yeah.
And of course, the cerebellum and basal ganglia are there,
Right.
making sure that our movements are precise and coordinated.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a lot going on.
That is a lot going on.
Okay, so let's bring this all back to everyday life.
Okay. Yeah.
And consider some concrete examples
Okay.
of how these senses, actually work together in our day-to-day activities.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, so let's revisit our coffee cup example.
Okay.
You're reaching for your coffee cup.
Yeah.
How many of these senses are actually involved in that, seemingly very simple action?
It's a perfect illustration of sensory integration.
Okay.
So your visual system initially helps you, locate the cup in space.
Right.
And then as you extend your arm,
Yeah.
proprioception's providing that constant feedback to your brain
Okay.
about the position and movement of your arm and hand.
Gotcha.
Now, let's say you happen to be walking while you're doing this.
Okay.
Your vestibular sense is what's helping you maintain your balance
Right.
and automatically adjusting your arm movements to compensate for any sway in your body. So your brain is continuously integrating all of this incoming sensory information
Right.
in real time
Okay.
to ensure that you can successfully grasp the cup
Yeah.
without spilling a drop.
It's amazing. Okay, so what about just a simple action like walking?
Yeah.
It feels so automatic
It does.
that we don't really think about all the sensory input that's actually involved.
We don't.
Yeah.
Walking is another great example of this sensory symphony in action.
Okay.
So proprioceptors in your legs and feet,
Yeah.
they're constantly communicating information to your brain
Okay.
about the position and movement of your limbs
Right.
as you take each step and shift your weight.
Okay.
The vestibular sense is crucial for maintaining your balance as your center of gravity changes with each stride.
Right.
And your visual system, it is helping you navigate your environment, allowing you to avoid obstacles,
Right.
stay on your intended path. So
Yeah.
it's this continuous interplay, right, of these different senses that allows us to move through the world
Yeah.
with, such apparent ease.
It's really incredible.
It really
Like
is.
we really take these abilities for granted.
We do.
Earlier you mentioned what can happen when the vestibular system is disrupted?
Right.
Like experiencing dizziness.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of effects might we experience if other parts of this, sensory network aren't functioning correctly?
So while, we don't necessarily want to delve too deeply into specific medical conditions, even temporary or minor disruptions,
Right.
can really highlight the importance of these senses.
Right.
So for instance, if someone experiences a temporary loss of proprioception,
Okay.
perhaps due to a nerve being compressed,
Right.
they might feel clumsy,
Okay.
have difficulty with fine motor control
Okay.
and coordinating their movements.
Right.
It really underscores just how much we're constantly relying on this
Yeah.
continuous stream of feedback from our bodies.
Yeah. You don't really realize it until it's gone, right?
Exactly.
So I guess for someone listening, maybe they're prepping for a presentation or trying to get up to speed on a new topic,
Right.
or even just, driven by their own curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Why should they find this information, about how our bodies sense movement relevant?
Well, understanding these fundamental sensory mechanisms,
Yeah.
it's really foundational to so many things. It underpins so many of our, more complex behaviors and
Yeah.
cognitive functions,
Yeah.
ranging from our motor skills to our ability to navigate through space,
Right.
to even, our sense of body awareness and how we interact with the world around us.
Right.
So whether you're involved in designing, user interfaces,
Okay.
studying human performance,
Right.
in sports, or other activities,
Right.
or even just trying to gain a deeper appreciation
Yeah.
for your own physical experiences.
Yeah.
A solid grasp of these basic sensory processes, it really provides valuable context and insights.
Yeah, it's true. It really does, like, put things into a new perspective.
It does.
Okay, so just to recap quickly,
Yeah.
our exploration on this deep dive.
Right.
Can you just like summarize one more time the key sensory systems that are involved in, sensing movement?
Absolutely. So we delved into the vestibular sense,
Right.
which is like our internal compass,
Right.
providing critical information about balance and orientation.
Yeah.
We then explored proprioception,
Right.
our body's amazing ability to sense its own position and movement in space.
Right.
And then we talked about the somatosensory cortex,
Yeah.
the brain's central processing hub for all sorts of body-related sensory information,
Right.
including touch and proprioception.
Right.
And all of these really sophisticated systems work, in this highly coordinated manner,
Right.
constantly integrating their signals,
Yeah.
in various brain regions,
Okay.
like the posterior parietal cortex,
Yeah.
to give us that seamless
Yeah.
and continuous perception of our body and its movement.
It's incredible. It really is a remarkable, feat of biological engineering
It is.
that we don't even think about.
We don't.
Like, we really just take it for granted.
Totally.
Think about how often you just, go about your day,
Yeah.
moving and orienting yourself in the world
Right.
effortlessly.
Yeah.
What could, a deeper understanding of these fundamental senses
Right.
tell us about our interaction with, everything around us,
Yeah.
even our sense of self?
Our sense of self. Exactly.
Something to think about.
It really is.
It's profound.
It is profound. And it opens up, a wealth of further questions.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Like, how do all of our other senses, touch and vision, how do they maybe refine and influence our perception of movement?
Mm-hmm.
In subtle and complex ways.
Right.
And what are some ways that those sensory systems can be, tricked?
Yeah.
We see it in different illusions. And how do they adapt and learn
Yeah, that's right.
in response to new challenges and environments?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's something to really ponder because there's always more to explore
Right.
in this incredible
Yeah.
and constantly evolving
Absolutely.
field of behavioral neuroscience.
Right. It's fascinating stuff. Thanks.
You're very welcome.